So I recently had the opportunity to see Gemini Man in 120 frames a second in 3D. There's only a few theaters across the country, about 14 theaters that are offering this format, and I thought it would be worthwhile to record some thoughts on it because I think some people might be interested to hear what it was like and if it's something they should try to seek out. So, a little backstory, I did see The Hobbit in high frame rate. I believe it was 48 frames a second. And just as an aside, Gemini Man is also being presented at 60 frames a second. I did not see that one. I actually think I will check it out just to see the difference between the 60 and 120. I remember after The Hobbit came out, people asked James Cameron what did he think about all the critical reaction to it. What a lot of people were saying about it is that it looked cheap. It looked like a BBC drama or a Masterpiece Theater video made-for-TV thing with low production values. And I distinctly remember his quote was, "Oh, well, the problem was they stopped at 48. What you really need is 120." And I remember at the time thinking, well, that's just hilarious because he's just doubling down on this so heavily. And so I was really curious as to Gemini Man because it's a little bit more grounded. It's not a fantasy movie that has to deal with a lot of prosthetics and effects and things, except for obviously the centerpiece CG effect. So I was interested in that. I was interested in the 120 frames. Is that actually a step up? Does it actually make things better or does it make things worse? So going into Gemini Man, I really didn't think it would be good, but I was just morbidly curious as to what it looked like. All right, so me and my friend sit down. The logos start, the Paramount logos start, and the Paramount logo is not in 120. We can tell it's still in 24 because you could see the stars floating by the lake in the Paramount logo, and there's frames, and we turn to each other and we're like, what is this? We paid for frames. Let's see some frames here. This is 24, obviously. And then the next logo, Skydance, is also like that. But then the third one, the Alibaba Pictures, I believe it is, that's when it like switches over and it's sudden, like immediately the first pixel of motion graphics that appears on screen. You're like, whoa, that's weird looking. It looks like someone switched over to a video game, because it just looked bizarre. And then the first scene is this train station scene. And it looks weird. I mean, there's no other way to say it. It just looks weird. And I do think, and by the way, no spoilers in this. I'm just going to give out some very vague things that happen early on. Like for the very first scene, as you see Will Smith setting up a sniper rifle to take a shot. And that whole sequence, I think that it looked cheap. It looked weird. It was distracting. I think that if I saw this movie as a normal movie, I wouldn't be thinking about these things. I would just be concentrating on the story, but in this case, I thought it was very distracting. I just, it looked cheap. It looked like a soap opera. It looked, Will Smith, by the way, is very good in this movie. So is Mary Elizabeth Winstead. But there are a couple supporting characters who I think, would have been totally fine. But I noticed in this high frame rate that the acting wasn't quite there, and it was kind of interesting. He talks to his handler earlier on, and that character. It really felt like they were in front of me doing the scene, like rehearsing for the actual movie, and Will Smith's like acting, and then this other guy's like trying to keep up, But so the first 20 minutes, I did settle down into this mode of like, okay, this is cheesy. This is like gimmicky, cheesy, a novelty. It's kind of fun to see. I kind of started enjoying it a little bit. Like, hey, what if Tommy Wiseau actually got Will Smith to be in his movie? Like, that's kind of what it felt like. And so I was kind of settling in and enjoying it on that level. And then the first action scene happened, and I kind of sat up a little bit. I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. It kind of reminded me of the first time I saw a Michael Mann movie like Heat or even Miami Vice, where all the gunshots were like really real sounding, and it like kind of takes you back, and it's like, whoa, this like feels really real. That's kind of how that first action scene felt. It wasn't very long. It was a quick one, and so I was like, that's actually kind of interesting. And then the movie goes on, and it's more kind of just dialogue and stuff. And then the second action scene is the motorcycle chase, which is in all the trailers, so it's not really a spoiler. That's the one where I was like, okay, I get it. This is pretty amazing looking. Anything high speed, anything where there's fast action, people are traveling at high rates of speed, shit's exploding. There's one part in that sequence where someone throws a grenade and it goes off, and it's the first time there's like an explosion on screen. And I was pretty wowed by it. I thought, oh my God, that looks crazy. And so it's definitely a double-edged sword because in the dialogue scenes, it all feels real. I guess the ultimate intent of this, why Ang Lee did it, was that he wanted it to feel more real. He wanted to remove barriers between you and the story. I do think it backfires half the time, where it is kind of distracting. Even when you get used to it, it's not, optimal. But then when there's high action, it really does feel like, okay, imagine this. You're out at a cafe and you're out with two actors, and like I said, they're kind of rehearsing this performance. They're rehearsing for their movie. They're running lines, and you're watching it. And it's like, oh, this is really cool. I'm watching these people in person acting. And then suddenly, shit blows up across the street, and everyone's going nuts, and you're like, holy shit, what's going on? That's the feeling it had because it really did feel real. And when these big spectacle kind of action set pieces happen, it really does feel real. And so that motorcycle chase was amazing. And it kind of, and then the funny thing is, after that, it cuts back to a dialogue scene, and it's not like, oh, I was suddenly used to it. It looked kind of bad again. So anytime the characters are just talking, it looks kind of bad, but then the action scenes look amazing. And so I was trying to think, like, is there any way you can switch between the two? That I feel like that would just be way too jarring. So I don't know. It's an interesting thing. There's one scene at the very end where a character does sort of a Tom Cruise run in a long take, and then parkours up a building. That was the most like jaw-dropping sequence, and it was nothing. It was a very simple action move that I think in a normal movie you wouldn't really think about it. But seeing it in high frame rate, it was incredible. And I just remember me and my friend were both very impressed by that shot, and it was very cool. So yeah, I would say if you have a chance to see Gemini Man in 120 frames a second, you absolutely should. It's not all of it's going to work. I think the dialogue stuff doesn't feel great, even though you can get used to it. And after a while, you do sort of get into the vibe of the movie. But the action scenes look incredible. Oh, and then just a quick note on the CG Will Smith. Just mind-blowing, like unbelievable. I was just staring at it in the high frame rate, and I was just kind of speechless. It's just flawless. I think the first scene, I couldn't stop staring at his mouth because I think that it's just like a hair off, like his lip animations. And then at the very, very end, the last time you see him, I think that must have been like the demo reel, or that must have been done first, because all of a sudden it looked like the worst it's ever looked. Like the very last scene with him, it's like, whoa, did they just tag this on in the last like final minutes and didn't have time to render it completely? But for the most part, it's just incredible CG. So yeah, that's Gemini Man. Definitely recommend seeing it at 120 frames a second. I actually want to go back, like I said, and see it in 60 to see what the difference is, because I wonder, is it really true that it's the higher rate that had this effect? So is it the higher frame rate, or is it just the way that it was filmed, or it was the quality of the CG, or it was just the fact that it was all real people? I don't really know. So I do want to know what the difference is. But the final thing I want to say is that I do think there's a future for this format. I do think there is value in it, but it really depends on the movie, and it really depends on how it's used. It's kind of like 3D. If you just slap it on to any movie, it's not going to really be that interesting or good. But if you really design a movie around it, there are movies that are made really, really well, that really use 3D, that enhance the experience. I kind of feel like high frame rate could be that. I think depending on the movie, I would see more movies like this. I think it needs to be kind of an event. I think it needs to be carefully considered. But I can see it, and especially as an option. I do not want every movie to be this way. There's some movies that I think would just look awful. I mean, most movies, probably. I don't think that this should be a standard in any way. There was an interview with Ang Lee where he said that watching older movies now, he is actually distracted by the choppiness of it and by the quote-unquote low frame rate. and he's just gotten so used to this that everything else looks weird. I would hate for that to be the case, because obviously there's 100 years of amazing movies that we're going to condition ourselves to make look bad. I hate that idea. That's terrible. Yeah. So those are my thoughts on Gemini Man in 120 frames a second. You can just Google it and find out which theaters have it around you. And if it's anywhere near you, even if it's like an hour away, I think I would recommend taking the time to, seek it out and see it. So, all right. I hope that was helpful. So catch you later.